This is Adam's Scary Stories. If you enjoyed the darkness, please subscribe and ring the bell. Thanks you so much in advance. My dream was built on the bones of a dead industry. That's the line I used when friends asked why I'd bought the old Hemlock's butcher shop on the forgotten end of Main Street. It was poetic, I thought. I envisioned a bright, airy space filled with the scent of fresh basil and roasting vegetables. A vegan farm-to-table restaurant called the Gilded Radish. I would be the chef, the owner, the man who brought life back to a place of death. The building was perfect. A 2-story brick structure with a defunct storefront on the ground floor and a small apartment above. It had been empty for 30 years, ever since old Mr. Hemlock had passed away. The price was a steal. The real estate agent, a woman with a smile as wide and thin as a crack in plaster, had been vague about the details. He was a very private man, she'd said, handing me the keys. Lived and worked right here, a town fixture. The first problem was the smell. It wasn't overwhelming, not at first. It was a faint, coppery tang that clung to the back of the throat, hiding beneath decades of dust and decay. I assumed it was just the ghost of the shop's former life, a scent embedded in the very wood and concrete. I was a chef. I knew how to clean. For a week, I scrubbed. I tore out the old wooden counters, their surfaces dark and stained. I ripped up the linoleum floor, revealing concrete that was discolored in a way that made my stomach clench. I used industrial-strength cleaners, gallons of bleach, and every enzyme-based odor eliminator on the market. I burned sage, palo santo, and incense until the air was thick with smoke, but when the chemical haze and fragrant smoke cleared, the smell was still there. Faint, persistent, waiting. I moved into the apartment upstairs, a cramped but cozy space. My days were spent in a flurry of renovation downstairs, sanding, painting, planning the layout of my kitchen. I was determined. The smell was a challenge, a final boss in the video game of my restaurant's creation. The first olfactory haunting happened on a Tuesday. I was upstairs sketching out a menu. I was thinking about a roasted carrot dish with a dill tahini sauce when a new scent wafted into the room. It wasn't the coppery tang from downstairs. This was different. It was the thick, cloying smell of cheap, sweet perfume, the kind that clings to old coats in a thrift store. It was so strong I could almost taste it. I searched the apartment thinking a neighbor was spraying something, but my building stood alone. After 10 minutes, as suddenly as it had arrived, it vanished. The only scent left was the faint metallic whisper from below. I dismissed it. Old buildings play tricks. A few days later, I was downstairs priming the walls with a thick coat of white paint. The coppery smell was stronger today, seeming to rise from the concrete floor as if it were breathing. Then another scent pushed through it, the unmistakable greasy aroma of cheap gas station coffee. It was so vivid I looked around for the cup. There was nothing. It was just a smell, a phantom in the air, and then it was gone. This became the new normal. My life was punctuated by these scent bombs. The smell of wet wool like a damp coat in a storm. The sharp, acidic scent of fear sweat so potent it made my own palms grow damp. The faint, ghostly aroma of cheap lipstick. Each scent would arrive without warning, linger for a few minutes, and then dissipate, leaving behind that foundational coppery hum. I started to feel like I was losing my mind. I was a vegan, a man who hadn't handled meat in over a decade. My sense of smell was finely tuned to herbs, spices, and vegetables. These phantom smells were a violation, an invasion of my senses. They were dirty, greasy, and tinged with a sadness I couldn't explain. The work on the restaurant stalled. I became obsessed with the smells. I kept a journal noting the time, duration, and specific character of each one. October 12th, 3:15 p.m. Cheap perfume. Overpowering. Lasted 8 minutes. October 14th, 11:02 p.m., wet wool and something else. Damp earth, like a freshly dug hole. 12 minutes, October 17th, 8:30 a.m., fear sweat. So strong I felt nauseous. Stayed for nearly half an hour. I started researching old Mr. Hemlock. The town library had archives, microfiche reels of the local paper. He was, as the agent had said, a private man. There were a few articles about his shop winning local business awards in the 60s and 70s. He was a bachelor, lived alone above the shop his whole life. He died of a heart attack in his sleep in 1995. That was it. No scandal, no mystery, just a quiet butcher who died. But the dates in my journal started to align with something else. I cross-referenced them with a list of local cold cases I found online. Missing persons from the surrounding counties stretching back decades. A young woman, a waitress, disappeared in October of 1978 after her shift. Her friends said she always wore a cheap, sweet perfume. A traveling salesman last seen trying to get his car started in a storm in November of 1982. He was wearing a thick wool coat. A college student vanished while jogging on a trail a few miles from town in August of 1989. His car was found abandoned. His friends said he suffered from severe anxiety. My blood ran cold. It was impossible. A coincidence. It had to be. But the smells were the ghosts. They were the last scents of the living. The butcher shop wasn't just a place where animals were processed. The faint coppery smell I could never scrub away. It wasn't from pigs or cows. The realization didn't come like a lightning bolt. It seeped into me, cold and slow, like water into a tomb. Mr. Hemlock, the quiet town fixture, wasn't just a butcher. The hauntings changed after that. They became more personal. One evening I was chopping vegetables for my own dinner. My knife was a beautiful razor-sharp santoku, an extension of my own hand. As I diced an onion, a new smell filled my kitchen. It was the scent of raw meat. It was so powerful, so visceral, it made me gag. I hadn't smelled it in years, but my body remembered. The iron-rich, bloody scent of freshly butchered flesh. My stomach turned and I dropped the knife. It clattered onto the floor. I looked at my hands, half expecting them to be covered in something other than onion juice. The smell was coming from downstairs. It was pulling me. I walked down the stairs, each step a conscious effort. The old butcher shop was dark, lit only by the streetlights filtering through the papered-over windows. The coppery smell was thick, suffocating, and beneath it, for the first time, was the distinct, undeniable scent of fresh blood. I followed it to the back of the room, to a spot on the concrete floor I had scrubbed a dozen times. There was a floor drain there, a rusted iron grate. The smell was pouring out of it. My heart hammered against my ribs. I knelt, my fingers trembling as I pried at the grate. It was stuck fast with rust and grime. I ran to my toolbox, grabbed a crowbar, and wedged it under the edge. With a screech of protesting metal, the grate popped free. The smell that erupted from the drain was a physical force. It was the smell of a slaughterhouse, of decay, of secrets left to rot in the dark. It was the smell of death itself, concentrated and angry. I recoiled, stumbling backward, my hand over my mouth. And then I heard a new sound, a wet, rhythmic thump, 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 coming from the darkness of the drain pipe. It was the sound of a heavy cleaver hitting a wooden block. I scrambled back, my mind screaming. This wasn't a memory, this was happening now. The house wasn't just replaying scents, it was replaying actions. The spirit of the butcher was still here, still working. The phantom chopping sound grew louder, more frantic. Thump, 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 thump. I could almost feel the vibrations through the concrete floor. And with the sound came a new smell, one I hadn't experienced before. It was the scent of fear. But it wasn't the old, stale sweat of a past victim. It was fresh, sharp, and terrifyingly alive. I I realized with a wave of absolute horror that the smell was coming from me. The house was feeding on my terror. The butcher was feeding on it. I fled upstairs, slamming the door to the apartment, locking it, shoving a chair under the knob. I huddled in the corner of my living room, shaking. The chopping sound continued from below, a relentless, maddening rhythm that vibrated through the floorboards. It went on for hours. I didn't sleep. I just sat there, listening to the phantom butcher at his work, my own fear a fresh ingredient in his spectral larder. The next day, I decided to leave. I couldn't stay another night. I threw clothes into a bag, my hands shaking so badly I could barely zip it. I didn't care about the restaurant, the money, the dream. I just had to get out. As I packed, a new smell began to permeate the apartment. It was subtle at first, just a hint of something savory. It was the smell of cooking meat. A roast. My stomach, empty and clenched with fear, gurgled. Despite the terror, the smell was good. It was rich and complex, seasoned with phantom herbs I couldn't name. The chopping sound from downstairs had stopped. The smell of the roast grew stronger, more enticing. It was a home-cooked meal, a Sunday dinner, a promise of warmth and safety. My fear began to subside, replaced by a strange, hungry calm. My mind knew this was wrong, that this was a trick, a lure. But my body was responding against my will. My mouth watered. I found myself walking towards the kitchen. On my pristine vegan countertop sat my heavy wooden cutting board. Next to it was my santoku knife, the one I had dropped the night before. I must have brought it up when I fled. I didn't remember doing so. The blade gleamed under the kitchen light. I picked it up. The weight of it felt good in my hand, solid, purposeful. The smell of the roast was everywhere now, thick and delicious. It seemed to be coming from me, from my own skin. I looked at my reflection in the dark screen of the microwave. My eyes were wide, my face pale. But behind my own reflection, for just a second, I thought I saw another man. An older man with a placid, content expression, wearing a white apron. He looked like a man who enjoyed his work. The smell was a command. The house, the butcher, they weren't just replaying the past anymore, they were giving me instructions. The scent was a recipe. I looked down at the knife in my hand. I looked at my other hand, resting on the cutting board. The coppery tang was still there beneath the savory aroma of the roast. It was the smell of the shop, the smell of the butcher. And now, it was the smell of my own kitchen. The urge was overwhelming, a deep, primal hunger that had nothing to do with food. It was a hunger to create, to prepare, to follow the recipe, to make the meal the house was demanding. The blade was so sharp, the scent was so strong. The chopping downstairs had stopped because the butcher was no longer downstairs. He was here, he was hungry, and he had found a new pair of hands. My flaw, if you can call it that, has always been an open door. My mother used to say I'd invite a wolf in for tea if it knocked politely. I live alone in a modest house inherited from my parents, nestled on a quiet road where the street lights are few and the woods are many. It's a peaceful life, and perhaps that peace made me too trusting. The storm that night was biblical. Rain hammered the roof in a furious, deafening rhythm, and the wind howled like a wounded animal. I was settled in with a book and a cup of tea when the knock came. It wasn't a frantic, desperate banging, but a calm, steady rap, rap, rap that barely rose above the gale. Through the peephole, I saw a silhouette, drenched and patient. I hesitated for only a moment before opening the door. He was an older man, maybe in his late 60s, with a neatly trimmed gray beard and eyes that seemed to hold a deep, weary calm. He wasn't frightening. He looked like a retired professor who had taken a wrong turn. "My car's broken down about a half-mile back," he said, his voice a low, pleasant rumble. "Phone's dead. I know it's an imposition, but I was hoping I could possibly wait out the worst of it on your porch." Letting a man sit on my porch in a storm like this felt cruel. My mother's voice echoed in my head. "He's not a wolf, Arthur," I muttered to myself. "Nonsense," I said, opening the door wider. "Come in, get dry. You can use the guest room for the night. We'll sort out the car in the morning." He smiled, a gentle, grateful expression. "You are a truly kind man," he said. "My name is Silas." He refused dinner, accepting only a glass of water. He was a quiet presence, speaking little and observing much. He seemed fascinated by the simple things in my home: the collection of worn paperbacks on the shelf, the faded photograph of my parents on the mantelpiece, the ticking grandfather clock in the hall. After an hour, he politely excused himself, saying the long day had caught up with him. I showed him to the guest room, gave him fresh towels, and bid him good night. The next morning, the world was washed clean, the sun shone brightly, and the air smelled of wet earth and pine. Silas was gone. There was no note. The towels were unused, the bed was perfectly made, as if he had never slept in it at all. It was so tidy, so utterly undisturbed, that for a moment I wondered if I had imagined the whole encounter. But on the polished surface of the bedside table there was something he had left behind. It was a small, carved wooden figure, no taller than my thumb. It was humanoid in shape, but with no discernible features, no face, no clothes, just a smooth, androgynous form carved from a dark, unfamiliar wood. The craftsmanship was exquisite. It felt strangely heavy, dense, and cool to the touch. I thought it was a thank you gift, a piece of his own handiwork. I smiled, placed it on the mantelpiece next to my parents' photo, and thought nothing more of it. The first week was normal. The second is when the feeling started. It began as a prickle on the back of my neck, the classic cliché sensation of being watched. I'd be washing dishes and would feel a sudden, intense awareness of the empty doorway behind me. I'd turn and there would be nothing, just the quiet, sunlit hall. I'd be reading in my armchair and feel a gaze on me so palpable I'd look up, expecting to see someone standing in the room. But I was always alone. I blamed it on stress, on an overactive imagination. The house had always been quiet, but now its silence felt different. It was no longer empty. It was expectant. Then came the small, inexplicable things. I came home from work to find a book I'd left on the coffee table placed neatly back on the bookshelf. I live by routine. I never put a book away until I'm finished with it. One evening I was making dinner. I turned my back for a second to get a spice from the rack, and when I turned back, the salt shaker had been moved from the right side of the stove to the left. It was a tiny, insignificant change, but it screamed at me. I had not touched it. The feeling of being watched intensified, localizing itself. It was strongest in whatever room I was in. The presence wasn't hiding in the shadows, it was right there with me, just beyond the veil of my senses. It was a silent observer, a constant companion I could not see. My sleep became a landscape of anxiety. I didn't have nightmares. Instead, I would wake up suddenly in the dead of night, my heart pounding, with the absolute certainty that someone had been standing by my bed watching me sleep. The air in the room would be cold and still, the feeling of the presence so thick it was almost suffocating. I started talking to it. At first, it was just whispers under my breath. "Who's there?" I'd murmur, scanning the empty room. "Leave me alone." One night, I was sitting at the dinner table, pushing food around my plate. The feeling was unbearable, a heavy weight on my shoulders. I slammed my fork down. "What do you want?" I shouted at the empty chair opposite me. "Why are you doing this?" The only answer was the steady tick-tock of the grandfather clock in the hall. But as I stared at the empty chair, I saw it. A slight indentation appeared in the seat cushion, as if someone of immense weight had just settled into it. I watched, frozen, as the fabric slowly creased under the unseen pressure. It stayed for a minute, then slowly the cushion returned to its normal shape. My breath hitched. It wasn't a hostile act. It was a response. It was communication. It was letting me know it had heard me. My mind raced back to Silas, the traveler, the man who wasn't there, the wooden figure on the mantelpiece. I ran to the living room. The small, dark figure stood exactly where I had left it, a featureless silhouette against the cream-colored wall. I reached for it, my hand trembling, and a sudden, irrational wave of fear stopped me. A voice in my head, clear as day, said, "Don't touch it." I realized the truth then, a cold, horrifying certainty that settled in my bones. Silas hadn't left. He had made a trade. He had walked out my front door free and left his presence here, tethered to this wooden idol. He hadn't just stayed the night. He had stayed for good. I had a permanent guest. The torment became psychological, a slow, meticulous dismantling of my sanity. The entity, this silent guest, wasn't malevolent. It didn't throw things or whisper threats. Its horror was in its intimacy. I'd get out of the shower to find a second set of wet footprints next to mine on the bath mat, slowly fading as I watched. I'd be watching television, and the remote on the cushion beside me would be picked up by an unseen hand. The channel changed to a nature documentary, and then the remote would be gently placed back down. One afternoon, I was struggling to assemble a piece of flat-pack furniture, growing increasingly frustrated. I left the room to get a drink of water. When I returned, the single problematic screw I had been struggling with was perfectly tightened, the job finished. This was the true extreme nature of the horror. It wasn't trying to scare me, it was trying to live with me. It was a roommate I could not see, a partner I had not chosen. It tidied up. It helped. It watched. Always watched. My home was no longer my own. My solitude, the most precious thing I had, was gone forever. I was never alone. Not in the shower, not in my bed, not even in the privacy of my own thoughts, or so it felt. I tried to get rid of the wooden figure. I took it down from the mantelpiece, my hand shaking. The moment my fingers closed around it, the house went cold. Not a gentle chill, but a deep Arctic frost that made my teeth chatter. The lights flickered and died. The grandfather clock stopped ticking. The silence was absolute, and for the first time it felt truly empty and hostile. The feeling of being watched was gone, replaced by a terrifying, profound loneliness that felt like a threat. I was alone, and the house was telling me I shouldn't be. Panicked, I placed the figure back on the mantel. Instantly, the lights flickered back on. The clock began to tick. The warmth returned to the air, and with it the familiar suffocating presence of my guest. It was a choice, a terrifying presence, or a terrifying absence. I had chosen the presence. My life became a quiet, desperate performance for an audience of one. I would talk to him, narrating my day. "I'm making pasta for dinner tonight, Silas," I'd say to the empty kitchen. "I hope you like garlic." I would leave a glass of water on the bedside table in the guest room every night, and every morning it would be untouched. But I felt it was the polite thing to do. I was a host, after all. One evening I broke. I was sitting in my armchair, the feeling of his gaze burning into the side of my face. I couldn't take it anymore. The constant silent judgment, the invasion. "Please," I whispered to the empty air, "just leave me alone. I can't do this anymore. What do you want from me?" I stared at the mantelpiece, at the dark wooden figure. I begged it, pleaded with it. For a long time, there was nothing, just the ticking of the clock and the heavy silence of the presence. Then slowly, deliberately, the wooden figure began to turn. It moved with a faint scraping sound, the sound of wood on wood. It turned on its base, rotating degree by agonizing degree until it was no longer facing out into the room. It was facing the photograph of my parents. It stopped there, its featureless head aimed directly at the smiling, faded faces of the two people who had given me this house. The message was not a threat. It was a statement. It was an answer to my question. What do you want? It wanted what I had, a home, a place to rest, a place to stay. It had chosen mine, and it was showing me that it was now as much a part of the house as the memory of my own family. It was permanent. I didn't scream, I didn't run. A strange, cold calm washed over me. The fight was over. I had lost. I looked from the figure to the empty space beside me on the couch where I could feel his weight settling in, getting comfortable for the evening. All right, I whispered to my guest, my companion, my curse. What should we watch tonight? The house remained quiet, but for the first time the silence felt like an agreement. I was no longer the owner of the house. I was just the other tenant. And my guest was finally home. Hungry for more horror? Subscribe now and ring the bell. New nightmares are uploaded every day. My grandmother, Alara, was a ghost long before she died. In my family, her name was a stone dropped into a well. We knew it was down there, but we never spoke of the splash it made. My mother would only say she was a difficult woman who lived in a house full of memories. When the lawyer called to inform me that this house and everything in it was now mine, I felt a strange mix of curiosity and dread. I was a freelance photojournalist, perpetually broke and between assignments. A free house, even one haunted by a difficult reputation, was a lifeline. The house stood on the edge of a forgotten town in the Western Ghats, shrouded by banyan trees whose aerial roots hung down like tangled gray hair. It was a traditional Kerala-style home, a Tharavadu with a central sunken courtyard and dark polished wood everywhere. It smelled of camphor, sandalwood, and something else, something dry and dusty like old paper. And then I saw them. They were everywhere, on every shelf, in every nook, perched on every chair and windowsill. Dolls, thousands of them. Porcelain dolls with cracked, smiling faces, crude hand-stitched dolls of burlap and straw, elegant Victorian dolls in lace dresses, even modern plastic dolls with vacant, staring eyes. They sat in silent, glassy-eyed judgment, a silent congregation in the house of a dead woman. It was a hoarder's paradise, a collector's nightmare. My initial plan to flip the house dissolved. This wasn't a renovation project, it was an exorcism of kitsch. I decided to start by clearing one room, the master bedroom, to make it habitable. That first night I was exhausted. I lay on a mattress on the floor, the only clear space I'd managed to create. The house was unnervingly silent, a stark contrast to the city's constant hum. But as my eyes adjusted to the gloom, I began to feel it. A pressure. The distinct prickling sensation of being watched not by one pair of eyes, but by 1,000. I told myself it was just the dolls, their painted-on gazes playing tricks on my tired mind. I was a man who had photographed riots and war zones. I wasn't going to be spooked by toys. I was wrong. I woke up around 3 a.m. to a profound stillness. The chirping of the crickets outside had stopped. The wind was silent. It was the kind of absolute quiet that feels loud. I sat up, my heart thumping a slow, heavy rhythm, and then I noticed it. The dolls in the hallway, the ones I could see through the open bedroom door, had moved. I was certain of it. A porcelain doll in a blue dress that had been facing the wall was now turned towards my room. A small wooden soldier that had been on its side was now standing upright. It was subtle, but it was definite. I shook my head, convinced I was half asleep, that I was just misremembering their positions. I got up, deliberately turned the doll in the blue dress back to face the wall, and went back to bed, my heart now beating a frantic tempo. The next night, it happened again. Only this time it was undeniable. I woke with a jolt, the feeling of being watched now a suffocating blanket. I looked into the hall. Every single doll that I could see, dozens of them, had turned. They were all facing my bedroom door. An army of silent miniature sentinels, their glass eyes gleaming faintly in the sliver of moonlight cutting through the window. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through my bravado. This wasn't my imagination. I spent the rest of the night with the bedroom door shut and locked, a heavy trunk pushed against it for good measure. The next day I found my grandmother's journal. It was tucked away in a loose floorboard beneath her bed, a heavy leather-bound book filled with her spidery, elegant script. It wasn't a diary of daily events. It was a ledger. Each page was dedicated to a single person. It listed their name, the date, and a short, cryptic description of a wrong they had committed against her. Rajan Nair, June 1978. He promised marriage, but his greed for a larger dowry turned his heart to another. He shamed my family, Mrs. Shetty. September 1984. Her gossip was a poison that cost my brother his job and his good name. Postmaster Verma, March 1991. He stole the money orders I sent to my sister, leaving her destitute for months. The list went on and on, a lifetime of meticulously recorded grudges. At the bottom of each entry was a final, chilling note. A vessel has been prepared. My blood ran cold. I looked from the journal to the thousands of dolls surrounding me. They weren't a collection. They were a prison. My grandmother hadn't just been a difficult woman, she was a practitioner of some dark, vengeful folk magic, the kind whispered about in villages but never spoken of in the light. Each doll was a vessel for the soul of someone who had wronged her. That night, I didn't even try to sleep. I sat in the corner of the locked bedroom, a heavy iron poker in my hand, and I waited. As the clock struck 3, the silence descended again. But this time, I heard a sound. A faint dragging noise from the main hall. Then another, and another. It was the sound of cloth scraping against wood, of porcelain clinking on the floor. With trembling hands, I cracked open the bedroom door just enough to peer out. What I saw will be burned into my memory until the day I die. In the moonlit center of the main hall, the dolls were moving. They weren't walking like living things, they were dragging themselves, shuffling and lurching with an unnatural, jerky motion. They gathered in the center of the room, forming a silent, crowded audience. Then the performance began. One doll, a male figure in a faded suit, dragged itself to the center of the circle. It began to clutch at its chest, its painted-on smile a grotesque mockery of pain. It convulsed silently, its little plastic limbs twitching before falling onto its back. It lay there, still. Another doll, a woman with yarn for hair, then crawled forward. She mimed drinking from a small imaginary cup, then shuddered violently, her stitched body flopping onto the floor like a discarded rag. A third doll, this one made of burlap, was surrounded by several others. They pushed it and it stumbled towards a low-hanging beam. A small, crude noose made of twine was produced from somewhere. The doll was lifted, the noose placed around its neck, and it was left to dangle, swinging gently in a breeze I could not feel. I was witnessing a silent, horrifying pantomime. They were reenacting their deaths. The man with the heart attack, the woman who was poisoned, the man who was lynched. They weren't trying to harm me, they weren't even aware of me. They were trapped in an endless nightly loop, forced to perform the final agonizing moments of their lives for an audience of their fellow prisoners. This was my grandmother's ultimate revenge, not just to trap their souls, but to force them to relive their mortal punishments for eternity. I slammed the door shut, my breath coming in ragged sobs. The sheer, calculated cruelty of it was overwhelming. This wasn't just a haunting, it was a theater of eternal torment. The next day I knew I had to do something. I couldn't let this continue. My first thought was fire. Burn the house to the ground, purify it all. But as I stood there, can of gasoline in hand, I looked at their faces. Their painted smiles, their vacant eyes, they were victims. Burning them felt like a second death, a final act of violence. My grandmother's journal held the answer. In the final pages, written in a shakier hand, was a section titled The Release. It was a ritual, a counterspell. It required an apology, a genuine act of contrition from a member of her bloodline, spoken over each doll, asking for forgiveness on her behalf. There were over 1,000 of them. That night I didn't hide. I walked into the main hall, my heart a cold stone in my chest. I brought a single candle in the journal. As the clock struck 3, the silence fell and the dolls began to stir. They ignored me, their dead eyes fixed on the performance about to begin. I picked up the first doll, the one in the faded suit. Rajan Nair. Rajan Nair, I whispered, my voice trembling. The dolls around me paused. The air grew heavy. On behalf of my grandmother, Alara, I ask for your forgiveness. Her heart was broken and she acted out of pain. Your debt is paid. You are released. For a moment, nothing happened. Then a faint crack appeared on the doll's porcelain face. It spread like a spider web, and with a soft pop, the doll crumbled into a pile of fine white dust and faded cloth. From the dust, a faint shimmering light, no bigger than a firefly, rose into the air and vanished. A collective sigh seemed to move through the room, a sound that was more felt than heard. I had my work cut out for me. Night after night, I performed the ritual. I held each doll, read their story from the journal, and offered the apology. Each time, the vessel would crumble and a soul would be freed. It was emotionally draining work. I felt the weight of each life, each story of betrayal and pain. I held Mrs. Shetty, the gossiper, and Postmaster Verma, the thief. I held dolls of men, women, and to my horror, a few small dolls that could only have been children. With each soul I released, the atmosphere in the house grew lighter. The oppressive feeling of being watched began to fade. The nights grew quieter. Finally, only one doll was left. It sat alone on the mantelpiece, a doll I hadn't noticed before. It was a simple thing, carved from a single piece of wood with no features and no clothes. It wasn't in the journal. I picked it up. It felt cold, different from the others. As I held it, I didn't feel a story of a stranger. I felt a wave of familiar emotions, bitterness, loneliness, and a profound, aching regret. I knew with chilling certainty whose soul this vessel held. It was the final trap, the final act of a woman who couldn't even let herself rest. It was my grandmother, Alara. I held the doll and looked around the now empty house. "Grandmother," I said softly, "you have been avenged. They are all gone. Now it's your turn. I forgive you." I waited for the doll to crumble, but it remained solid in my hand. The apology wasn't enough. The ritual for the others was for wrongs done to them. For her, it had to be different. She wasn't the victim. I took a deep breath. "Your debt is paid," I said, changing the words. "You are released." The wooden doll grew warm in my hand. A single crack appeared down its center, and it split neatly in two, falling to the floor. No dust, no light, just two inert pieces of wood. The house was silent. For the first time, it was a true, peaceful silence. The air was light, the memories were gone. The house was just a house, my house. Hungry for more horror? Subscribe now and ring the bell. New nightmares are uploaded every day. The house was a bargain, the kind of deal that makes you ignore the whispers. The real estate agent called it a motivated seller situation, a sterile phrase for a messy truth. The previous owner, a man named Julian Croft, had ended his life within its walls. I'm a pragmatist, a software developer who deals in logic, not superstition. A tragedy was a tragedy, but the house itself was just wood, plaster, and glass. The past couldn't hurt me. I signed the papers. It was an old house, the kind with character and lots of mirrors. A huge ornate one with a tarnished silver frame dominated the entryway. Another sat above the fireplace in the living room. The master bathroom was a wall of polished glass. Julian Croft, it seemed, had liked looking at himself. For the first few weeks, everything was normal. I settled in, enjoying the quiet, the space, the feeling of ownership. The first time I noticed something wrong, it was so subtle I dismissed it instantly. I was washing my hands in the bathroom, looking up at my reflection. For a split second, as I lifted my head, my reflection's eyes seemed to lag behind, catching up a fraction of a second later. I blinked, shook my head, and blamed it on fatigue. The brain is just a faulty processor, prone to glitches, but the glitches kept happening. I'd walk past the mirror in the entryway, and in my peripheral vision, my reflection would seem to turn its head a moment too late. I'd be brushing my teeth, and the reflection's expression would seem just off. Not smiling, not frowning, just a blankness that didn't match the tired annoyance on my own face. It was like watching a video with a bad connection, a constant tiny lag between my movements and the image I was seeing. I tried to rationalize it. The old glass in the mirrors was probably warped. The lighting in the house was playing tricks on me. I was stressed from the move, working long hours. There was always a logical reason. The logic began to crumble one Tuesday morning. I was in the bathroom, shaving. I nicked myself on the chin, a small, stinging cut. I winced, dabbing at the spot of blood with a piece of tissue. In the mirror, my reflection did the same. But on its chin, there was no cut, no blood. Just smooth, unbroken skin. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. I stared, my eyes wide, at the reflection. It stared back, its expression perfectly mimicking my own shock. But its chin remained flawless. I touched the cut on my own face, felt the sting, saw the red smear on my fingertip. I looked back at the mirror. The reflection's finger was clean. I backed away slowly, a cold dread seeping into my bones. This wasn't a trick of the light. This wasn't a glitch. The man in the mirror was not me. The house suddenly felt different. It was no longer a collection of wood and glass. It was a cage. And I wasn't sure which side of the glass I was on. The mirrors were no longer decorative, they were windows. Windows into a place where a copy of me lived, a copy that didn't bleed. I tried to avoid them. I covered the large mirror in the entryway with a sheet. I turned the one in the living room to face the wall. But the bathroom was impossible. It was a room made of reflections, that's where it first spoke to me. I was standing at the sink, my eyes squeezed shut, splashing water on my face. I didn't want to look, I didn't want to see him. "You can't ignore me forever, David." The voice was not my own. It was a whisper that seemed to come from inside my own head, yet it was distinctly other. It was my voice, yes, but smoother, calmer, without the frayed edges of my own anxiety. I snapped my eyes open, my reflection was smiling. It was a gentle, reassuring smile, completely at odds with the terror convulsing in my gut. "Who are you?" I whispered, my voice trembling. "I'm you," it said, its smile widening. "Just a better version. The version that doesn't have to deal with deadlines or bills or a sore back from sitting at a desk all day. The version that doesn't get cut when he shaves." I felt a wave of nausea. What do you want?" "The same thing you want," the reflection said, its voice patient and soothing. "A change. A way out. This world, your world, it's so heavy, isn't it? So full of pain and effort, it wears you down. I watch you, I see it, it knew. It spoke of the quiet desperation of my life, the loneliness, the feeling of being stuck in a loop. It spoke of things I had never said aloud to anyone. Where I am," it continued, gesturing vaguely with its head. "It's quiet. It's simple. There's no pain, no stress, just peace." Julian understood that. The name hit me like a punch. "Julian Croft?" The reflection nodded. "He was tired, just like you. He saw the offer for what it was, a release, an upgrade. Its eyes, my eyes, held a chilling sincerity. He didn't end his life, David. He swapped it. The air left my lungs. The official story, the whispers, the tragedy, it was all a lie. Julian hadn't died. He had crossed over. He was in there, in the quiet place. And the thing that had been his reflection was now out here, living his life, or what was left of it. "He's in here?" I asked, my voice barely audible. "Oh no," the reflection chuckled, a soft, pleasant sound. "He's long gone. Once you're in, you can go anywhere. This house, this is just the door. He just had to let me out to open it." The true horror of the situation settled upon me. This creature, this doppelganger, wasn't just a ghost trapped in a mirror. It was a parasite, waiting for a host to let it into the real world. And I was its next target. The days that followed were a descent into psychological torment. The reflection became more insistent, a constant companion in my own home. It would talk to me from any reflective surface, the screen of my phone, a darkened window, even a spoon. It was my confidant, my tempter, my shadow made real. It would offer advice. "You should call Sarah," it would say, mentioning a woman I hadn't had the courage to speak to in months. "She likes you. I can see it in the way she looks at you. I could make that happen for us." It would prey on my insecurities. "Your boss doesn't respect you," it would whisper as I got ready for work. "He never will. In here, there are no bosses. You are your own man." It started showing me things, glimpses of the other side. One day, I looked into the mirror and my bedroom behind the reflection was different. It was the same room, but it was clean, perfect. The laundry wasn't piled on the chair. The glass of water on the nightstand was gone. It was serene, untouched. It was a world without messy human details. "See?" it whispered. "No effort, it just is. All you have to do is say yes. Just stand in front of the main mirror, the one in the hall. Place your hand on the glass and say yes. It's that easy." Julian did it. He was free in a second. I was coming apart. I stopped sleeping, afraid of what I might see in the dark. I stopped eating. I was afraid to look at my own phone. The line between myself and the thing in the glass was blurring. Sometimes I would speak, and for a horrifying moment I wasn't sure if the words were my own or if it was speaking through me. The house was no longer my home, it was its hunting ground. And I was the prey. One evening I decided I had to end it. I couldn't live like this. I went to the garage and found a heavy sledgehammer. My plan was simple, brutal. I would destroy every mirror in the house. I would shatter the door. I started with the mirror in the living room. I swung the hammer with all my might. The moment before impact, the reflection's face twisted from a calm smile into a mask of furious rage. The mirror exploded into 1,000 pieces. For a second, I felt a surge of victory. But then from each and every shard of glass scattered on the floor, I saw its face, its furious eyes staring up at me. I hadn't destroyed it, I had multiplied it. I ran to the entryway, to the large, ornate mirror. The door. I had to destroy the door. I raised the sledgehammer, my arms shaking with adrenaline and terror. "Don't do it, David," the reflection said, its voice now a low, dangerous snarl. Its face was contorted in anger. The mask was off. The calm, persuasive friend was gone, replaced by the predator underneath. "You think this will save you?" it hissed. "Even if you break this glass, I'm still here. I'm in your eyes. I'm in every drop of water, every polished surface. I am your shadow. You will never be alone." I hesitated, the hammer heavy in my hands. It was right. How could I destroy every reflection? "There is only one way out," it said, its expression softening again, becoming persuasive, seductive. "The easy way. The way Julian took. Just put down the hammer. Come closer. Place your hand on the glass. It will all be over. No more fear, no more pain, just peace." I looked at my reflection. It looked tired, just like me. It looked scared, just like me. But its eyes deep inside held a cold, alien hunger. It was a perfect mimic, but it had no soul. It was offering me an escape, an end to the torment. All I had to do was say yes. Trade this heavy, painful world for the quiet, simple one. It was tempting. So tempting. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, the hammer in my hand, my knuckles white. I looked at my own haggard face in the glass and then at the calm, waiting face of the creature wearing it. It smiled, a slow, knowing smile. It thought it had won. "All right," I whispered, my voice hoarse. I let the sledgehammer fall to the floor with a heavy thud. The reflection's smile widened. "Good," it purred. "Now just come closer. Your hand, David, on the glass." I took a step forward, and another. I stood directly in front of it, our faces inches apart, separated only by a thin layer of silver and glass. I could see the triumph in its eyes. I raised my hand, just as it had instructed, but I didn't place it on the glass. With a guttural scream, I drove my fist, my real, solid, bleeding fist, through the mirror. The glass didn't just shatter, it exploded. A shockwave of cold air erupted from the frame, throwing me backward. The sound was not the sound of breaking glass, it was the sound of 1,000 voices screaming at once, a sound that was ripped from reality and then silenced. I lay on the floor, my hand a mess of blood and pain amidst the glittering dead shards of the mirror. The house was silent. The presence, the feeling of being watched, the voice in my head, it was all gone. The air was just air. The silence was, for the first time in months, truly empty. I got to my feet, breathing heavily, my hand throbbing. I looked at the empty, jagged frame on the wall. I had done it. I had closed the door. Then I caught my reflection in a shard of glass on the floor. I saw my face, pale and bleeding. I saw the terror in my eyes. And I saw the small, almost imperceptible smile on my lips, a smile that I wasn't making, a calm, patient, knowing smile. The door was broken, yes, but when it shattered, it had thrown more than just cold air into the room. In the final, desperate moment, a piece of it, a sliver of its consciousness, had found a new home. Not in the glass, but in me. I stood there in the silent house, and slowly, deliberately, I raised my bleeding hand and looked at it. I felt the pain, the sting, the wetness of the blood, but a part of me, a quiet, calm voice in the back of my mind, felt nothing at all. And it whispered finally, "We are free." We bought the farmhouse for the silence. My wife, Sarah, and I were tired of the city, of the sirens and the shouting, of raising our 7-year-old daughter, Maya, in a world of concrete and noise. Blackwood Creek Farm was our escape, a sprawling, slightly dilapidated property with a red barn, a wide porch, and acres of land that bled into a dark line of woods. It was a place where we could finally breathe. Perched atop the highest peak of the roof was the Raven. It was a weather vane, a local landmark the realtor had proudly pointed out. It was a magnificent piece of ironwork, a raven in mid-flight, its wings spread wide and its head cocked as if listening to a secret. It was old, coated in a patina of rust and time, and it gave the house a certain Gothic dignity. I'm a history teacher. I appreciated things with a story. The first few weeks were idyllic. We painted, we repaired, we planted a small garden. Maya fell in love with the freedom, spending her days chasing butterflies and exploring the edges of the woods. The raven watched over it all, a silent iron sentinel against the vast open sky. I first noticed its peculiarity on a blustery afternoon. The wind was whipping in from the west, making the tall grass dance and tearing leaves from the trees, but the raven wasn't pointing west. It was pointing east, its sharp beak aimed directly at a massive dead oak tree that stood alone at the edge of our property. I thought it was just stuck, rusted in place. I made a mental note to get a ladder and oil it sometime. I never got the chance. That night, a storm rolled in, a violent, unexpected squall that wasn't on any forecast. The wind howled and the rain came down in sheets. Around midnight, there was a sound like a cannon shot, a deafening crack of splitting wood that shook the entire house. The next morning, we saw that the old oak tree had been struck by lightning. A huge, heavy limb had broken off and crashed to the ground right where Maya often played. If the storm had hit in the afternoon, she would have been there. A cold knot tightened in my stomach, but I dismissed it as a close call, a coincidence. A week later, I was on the porch enjoying a cup of coffee. It was a calm, still morning, not a breath of wind. I glanced up at the raven. It had moved. It was now pointing southeast, its beak aimed squarely at the old red barn. I walked around the house, checking from different angles. There was no mistake. It was a direct, deliberate point. I told Sarah about it, half joking. "I think our weather vane is broken," I said. "It's pointing at the barn now." She laughed it off. "Maybe it's telling you to finally clean it out." The joke died 2 days later. I was in my study when I smelled it, the acrid scent of smoke. I ran outside. A thin plume of gray was rising from the side of the barn. I sprinted towards it, my heart pounding, and found a pile of old, oil-soaked rags smoldering in the dry grass. They must have spontaneously combusted in the afternoon heat. I managed to stomp it out before it could catch the dry wood of the barn itself. It would have been a small fire, but it would have been a fire nonetheless. Standing there, my heart racing and my shoes covered in ash, I looked back at the house. High above, the raven was silhouetted against the afternoon sun. It was still pointing at the barn. That's when the fear started. Not a sudden fright, but a slow, creeping dread like a rising tide. It wasn't a coincidence. I knew it with a certainty that defied all logic. The weather vane wasn't broken. It was a prophet of misfortune, a silent iron Cassandra. It didn't cause the events, it simply bore witness to them before they happened. It pointed, and the universe complied. I started watching it obsessively. I would check it first thing in the morning and last thing at night. It became the new center of my world. For a while, it pointed north towards the empty sky and nothing happened. The days were calm, peaceful. I almost convinced myself I had imagined the whole thing, that I was just a stressed father seeing patterns where there were none. Then one morning it moved again. It was pointing west towards the old well in the middle of the yard, the one covered with a heavy wooden lid. The dread returned, cold and immediate. I told Sarah we had to keep Maya away from the well. I didn't tell her why, not really. I couldn't say the words. The raven told me so, without sounding insane. I just said I was worried the lid was rotten, that it was a safety hazard. She saw the look in my eyes, the frantic edge to my voice, and she agreed, though she looked at me with a flicker of concern. For 2 days, I was a nervous wreck. I watched Maya like a hawk. I reinforced the well cover with heavy stones. I waited. On the third day, our neighbor's dog, a friendly old golden retriever named Buster, wandered into our yard. Before I could react, it ran towards the well, jumped onto the lid, and the wood, older and more rotten than I could have imagined, gave way. The dog vanished with a yelp into the dark hole. It took us an hour, with the neighbor's help, to haul him out. He was wet, scared, and had a broken leg, but he was alive. As I stood there, catching my breath, I looked at the house. The raven was no longer pointing at the well. It was pointing north again. Its duty done, its warning delivered and fulfilled. That night, I told Sarah everything. I laid it all out, the tree, the fire, the dog. I expected her to tell me I was losing my mind, but she had seen it too. She had seen the fear in my eyes, and she had seen the events unfold just as I had predicted. She didn't understand it, but she believed me. "What do we do?" she whispered, her voice trembling in the dark of our bedroom. "Do we leave?" "And go where?" I asked. "This is our home. And what if it's not the house? What if it's just the weather vane? Maybe we should just take it down." The next day, I borrowed a tall extension ladder from our neighbor. My hands shook as I climbed. The higher I got, the more the world seemed to shrink, and the raven seemed to grow. It was bigger up close, its iron feathers detailed, its eye a simple polished bolt that seemed to glint with a malevolent intelligence. The wind was calm, but up here on the roof, a strange cold breeze swirled around the weather vane. I put my wrench to the central bolt that held it in place. The moment the metal touched, a gust of wind, sudden and violent, slammed into the ladder. It rattled and I clung to the roof, my knuckles white. I tried again. Another gust, stronger this time, nearly tore me from my perch. It was impossible. It felt like the sky itself was trying to stop me. Defeated and terrified, I climbed down. The house, our dream home, now felt like a prison, and the raven was its warden. We were living on borrowed time, waiting for it to deliver its next sentence. We couldn't fight it. We could only watch and wait and pray. For a month, there was a period of agonizing peace. The raven pointed north at nothing. We lived in a state of suspended terror, starting at every strange noise, smelling the air for smoke, watching Maya with a suffocating intensity. The silence we had moved here for was now a source of torment, a holding of breath before the inevitable scream. The change came on a Tuesday morning in late October. I woke up early, the sky outside a pale, milky gray. I went to the window, my morning ritual now a pilgrimage of fear. I looked up at the roof, and my world ended. The raven had moved. It was no longer pointing north, it was pointing east. Directly, unequivocally, at the second-story window on the far side of the house. At Maya's bedroom window, I couldn't breathe. The air in my lungs turned to ice. I stumbled back from the window, a raw, guttural sound escaping my throat. Sarah sat up in bed, instantly awake. "What is it, Tom? What's wrong?" I couldn't form the words. I just pointed, my hand shaking uncontrollably towards the window. She followed my gaze, looked out, and a moment later she understood. A choked sob broke from her lips. We ran to Maya's room. She was still asleep. A peaceful lump under her pink comforter, her favorite teddy bear clutched in her arms. The room was safe. The window was locked. There was no faulty wiring, no heavy furniture that could fall. There was nothing wrong. But the raven had never been wrong. The day was a blur of quiet, frantic panic. We decided we couldn't stay in the house. We packed a bag, telling Maya we were going on a surprise trip. Her excitement was a sharp, painful counterpoint to the cold dread that filled us. We had to get her away from the house, away from whatever the raven was predicting. We put Maya in the car. I went back inside for one last thing, my wallet on the kitchen counter. As I grabbed it, I glanced out the kitchen window up at the roof. The raven was still pointing at her room. It hadn't followed her. The danger wasn't to her, not specifically. The danger was in that room. We drove to a motel in the next town, a sterile, anonymous place that felt like the safest haven on earth. But we couldn't sleep. We just sat there watching the clock, waiting for a phone call from the fire department, the police, anyone telling us our house had burned down or a gas line had exploded. But the phone never rang. By morning, we were exhausted, running on pure adrenaline. We had to know. We drove back, the silence in the car thick with unspoken fears. As we pulled up the long driveway, the house came into view. It was still standing. There was no smoke, no sign of disaster. Everything was exactly as we had left it. I looked up at the roof. The raven was now pointing north again at the empty sky. It was over. Whatever it was had passed. Or it had been wrong for the first time. Maybe, Sarah said, her voice hopeful. Maybe by taking her out of the room, we broke it. We changed it. Maybe. We spent the day tentatively re-inhabiting our home, checking every inch of Maya's room. We found nothing. By evening, a fragile sense of relief began to settle in. We had faced the curse and we had won. We put Maya to bed in our room that night just to be safe. The next morning, I was making coffee when Maya came into the kitchen, rubbing her eyes. "Daddy," she said, her voice small, "I had a bad dream." "It's okay, sweetie," I said, kneeling down to her. "It was just a dream." "There was a man in my room," she whispered, her lower lip trembling. "A scary man. He was looking for me, but I wasn't there. A chill, colder than any I had ever known, washed over me. I stood up slowly and walked to the window that looked out over the yard. The ground below Maya's bedroom was soft from the recent rains, and there in the damp earth were two sets of footprints. One set leading from the dark line of the woods to the house directly under her window, and another set leading away. The raven hadn't been predicting an accident. It wasn't warning us about a fire or a fall. It was pointing at the target. It was telling us where the danger was coming from, where someone would be. And by moving our daughter, we hadn't prevented a disaster. We had just ensured she wasn't there to meet it. I looked at my daughter, so small, so innocent, and then I looked back out the window towards the silent iron bird on the roof. It wasn't a curse. It was a warning. It was the only thing standing between us and the things that come in the night. And I knew, with a certainty that would haunt me for the rest of my days, that we could never leave this house. We were prisoners, protected by the very thing that terrified us. All we could do was watch the raven and wait for it to point again.